Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Beshar. I'm the General Counsel of Marsh and McLennan, the world's largest risk advisor, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this joint program being hosted by the Foreign Policy Association, one of the preeminent foreign policy think tanks in the United States, and NYU's Center for Global Affairs. At a time when cyber attacks fill the headlines and many experts believe that COVID-19 will accelerate that threat, is it really feasible to believe that cyber peace is achievable? Is it pie in the sky, or is it something real and something that is within our grasp with focused effort? So we have three terrific experts to help answer that question and many others. So first, we have Scott Shackelford. Scott, will you wave? An associate professor at Indiana University and the Cybersecurity Program Chair. Before this panel started, I asked each of the panelists if they would tell me how they first got interested in cybersecurity. And Scott said he wrote his senior thesis on space, and that he's always been interested in kind of new domains, new frontiers. He was very bummed that yesterday's SpaceX launch was delayed, but he's following it with great focus. Second, we have Pano Giannakougeorgios, who's a professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Prior to NYU, he spent 8 years working at the Air Force, where among other responsibilities, he was the dean of the Air Force Cyber College. And the Air Force has really been a fabulous training ground for many of the top cyber experts in the United States. Individuals like Kevin Mandia, the CEO of FireEye, and General Suzanne Vautrinot, who serves on many corporate boards. And so Pano's story was a little bit different. He was in 5th grade and his class was playing the game of cat and mouse, and the teacher locked the students' access to the game and said, who can figure out how to unlock it and get back into the game? And Pano did so, and there was born a career in cybersecurity. And third, we have Andrea Bonime-Blanc, who is the founder and CEO of GEC Risk Advisory. She has decades of corporate experience at companies like Bertelsmann and PSE&G. She's a prominent speaker on governance issues in Davos, on Bloomberg TV, on the video news network Cheddar. I had to look that one up, Andrea. And she is an expert in advising boards of directors and management teams on how to grapple with cyber threats. So what we're going to do is start with the 5-minute intro by each speaker, but all four of us really want this to be an interactive program. We've already gotten some great questions that have come in, and so please submit your questions now and throughout the next hour through the YouTube live stream chat process. And so Scott, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that really kind introduction. And thanks again to NYU and the Foreign Policy Association for organizing this event. It's a really timely one and one I'm excited to participate in. I got interested in cyber peace during a visiting gig I was doing at Notre Dame back in 2013. And I was writing a book at the time on cyber war, right? Which was a pretty well-trodden ground at that point. And frankly, it was a bit of a downer. So when I came across the literature on positive peace there, that kind of got me interested in flipping the paradigm a little bit and starting to think more about, hey, what's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet? And then realistically, how could we actually get there? At that point, not much had been written about cyber peace. There was some work that the World Federation of Scientists and the Vatican, believe it or not, hence the Notre Dame connection there, were doing. And they defined cyber peace back then as a universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesale state of tranquility, which sounds lovely. I think we'd all agree, especially right now. But unfortunately, that's just not going to happen anytime soon. So rather than thinking about it in terms of a negative cyber peace, in other words, the end of cyber attacks, I wanted to think about it more in terms of a positive stance. What's the best practices that we could put into place to make a more sustainable and peaceful cyberspace for ourselves and our kids going forward? Even to be fair, though, even the ITU and the World Federation of Scientists, they realized that that definition, even back then, wasn't watertight, though. but rather an incremental in its list of ingredients. So I guess you could say I've been baking a little bit ever since. And I reorganized my book project back then, which became Managing Cyber Attacks in International Law, Business and Relations in Search of Cyber Peace, which was a Cambridge Press book that came out back in 2014. And each chapter in that book kind of goes up the stack, as it were, to talk about the governance challenges at the physical level, the governance challenges that firms are facing, that countries, and ultimately the international community. As part of the process of writing that book, I asked lots of folks about what they thought cyber peace was, and I got back some wonderful answers. Michael Dubose, who used to be at the Department of Justice, for example, told me that cyber peace would be an entire weekend without my BlackBerry going off, right? So it's more of a pragmatic stance, and also kind of dates the quote, right? But ultimately, I landed on thinking about cyber peace in terms of 4 pillars, kind of distilling down some of the work that had been done by the Vatican and other institutions. And those 4 pillars were, first, a system that respects human rights and freedoms. So that kind of builds from FDR's 4 freedoms and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's remarks on internet freedom. As part of that, we've looked at a lot of national cybersecurity strategies, for example, to see how they're thinking about human rights and peace in this context. And also, I've begun work on a cyber peace index, which I'd be happy to talk more about. Mm-hmm. The second pillar is spreading internet access along with cybersecurity best practices. So that recognizes the rights and responsibilities both that we as users have in cyberspace. And there's some overlap there, of course, that we can talk more about too, since there's an active debate about internet access being a human right, along with privacy and even cybersecurity itself. Third pillar was strengthening governance mechanisms by fostering multi-stakeholder collaboration. So kind of keep the big tent approach that we've had throughout the history of internet governance and pushing back against this idea of cyber sovereignty, which does have some benefits in terms of accountability, but also major issues both on the security side and the human rights side of the equation. And the fourth pillar is one we've been exploring a lot over the last couple of years, and that's promoting stability and sustainable development. So stability being a key foundation, for example, that the Global Commission on Cyber Stability has been actively engaged with. There's been a lot of research projects more recently that we've been developing to kind of dig into these pillars in more detail. One article is called Inside the Global Drive for Cyber Peace that maps these 4 pillars on top of a lot of initiatives that we've seen come out over the last couple of years, which I'd be happy to discuss further, like the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace and the Christchurch Call. The Paris Call was really noteworthy because it now has more than 60 governments signing on, hundreds of companies and other institutions, including, I'm happy to say, universities, IU being the first one in the world to sign up, and includes elements of combating intellectual property theft, cyber hygiene, offensive hackback from the private sector, etc. We also have a couple of book projects that I wanted to mention, including Governing New Frontiers in the Information Age Towards Cyber Peace. That's a book I have coming out later this year from Cambridge Press that explores lessons from different frontiers of international relations, including the deep seabed, climate, Antarctica, and sustainable development writ large. There's a whole chapter on climate change and cyber attacks to find lessons, for example, from the Paris Agreement on climate change back in 2015 that could be applied in thinking about cybersecurity challenges. Also have a book on the Internet of Things, which is a very hot topic these days as we think about building accountability and maybe even new liability frameworks to do more to hold perpetrators of cyber attacks and even companies that have lacked cybersecurity accountable. And there's a lot of different approaches explored in that I'm sure we'll be talking more about, like strict liability, reasonableness standards like we're seeing in California, safe harbor provisions like we see in Ohio, even codes of conduct, such as from GDPR and disclosure regimes, which is the global general data protection regulation from the EU. Finally, we have an edited volume that I'm really excited about that Pano is involved with as well, called Cyber Peace, Charting a Path Forward toward a more sustainable, stable, and secure cyberspace, which is a Cambridge Press edited volume coming out next year with Chris Ankerson from NYU and Frédéric Duzot from Paris 8, who's also one of the commissioners on the Global Commission for Cyber Stability. And that is really a wonderful effort because it involves disciplines and lots of scholars and practitioners, including folks from the Cyber Peace Institute and the Cyber Peace Foundation. There's a whole ecosystem of organizations really growing up around this topic. I'm also heartened to see a lot more students getting in the game as well. There's a Cyber Peace Corps that's now been established, which is really neat to see, as well as a lot of clinics that are starting work in this space to basically help students apply what they're learned, help protect local critical infrastructure in the process, and get involved in some of these bigger questions. And hopefully we're going to see more of those opportunities spread out from there.
Great, Scott. Thank you very much for that. 4 pillars is a useful framework for all of us to consider. And I think I counted at least 4 books that you're working on. So Pano, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Scott. I'm actually going to dive down one of the pillars of sustainability and stability. So as the world attention shifted from our everyday lives to the pandemic, which we find ourselves in, a critical event for cyberspace, in my opinion, occurred. For over a year, a team of experts under the mandate of the National Defense Authorization Act worked across party lines, government agencies, and society to produce a robust set of recommendations for how to make cyberspace safer and more secure. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission included many notions of deterrence, strategic stability, how to address threat actors, and other things along that trajectory. What I'm going to focus on in my introductory remarks is not that. It's focused on a recommendation called 4.2, which I'll just read out here for reference. So recommendation 4.2 is Congress should pass a law establishing that final goods assemblers of software, hardware, and firmware are liable for damages from incidents that exploit known and unpatched vulnerabilities. I'm sure most of you are thinking, well, that's kind of anticlimactic. For those of you who are interested in cyber as an area of strategic studies, you may have been waiting for clearly drawn red lines, answering questions such as what is a cyber attack and other threat-oriented policy solutions, which I believe we will be getting into during our discussion. Although those kinds of questions are important in their own right and addressed in the Solarium report, recommendation 4.2 has perhaps the most potential of all recommendations to increase the cost of cyber attacks and in the longer term, put the advantage of cyber conflict into the hands of system owners and defenders to help towards that aspirational goal of a stable and secure, peaceful cyberspace. So if we focus on vulnerabilities, that's really the key here. By focusing on vulnerabilities rather than on threats, it becomes more likely to achieve that cyber peace. So vulnerability, to serve as a translator, is an intangible and not easy to comprehend concept. So basically, when digital code is created, foundations of cyberspace are laid all over the world. So it gives us the impression that this domain is fast-paced and what allows for cyberspace to be man-made. Being man-made, errors exist in code, and that's basically what a vulnerability is. It's a weakness that can accidentally be triggered. I don't mean a trivial password. I don't mean a malicious insider who is abusing their access and privileges, and I don't mean backdoors that are intentionally placed in software. What I'm talking about here is a pure and complex coding error created by a well-intentioned programmer that has had to meet tight production deadlines of his or her own to assure product gets to market on time. So software vulnerabilities are relatively well understood. However, there's also the complexity of patching a vulnerability. So the act of patching is hard. Organizations need to take patches that are made available from software vendors, and that's really where that recommendation 4.2 is focused on. It's the availability of a patch. Organizations need to apply patches as fast as they can for individual consumers. That's usually a straightforward process. However, in a complex cyber enterprise like a hospital, it becomes a very challenging game of the so-called cat and mouse between hackers, defenders, the IT department, and doctors. The IT department in the hospital may want to upgrade a system to put a patch to inoculate their digital lifeblood. However, a doctor will need access to medical records in order to get into and save systems. So long story short, if we flip the risk equation from threats to vulnerabilities, focusing on vulnerabilities and trying to design them out of cyberspace may pay dividends in the longer run towards that goal of creating a stable and sustainable cyberspace. So I believe my 5 minutes are up, and I'm happy to pass it along to our next.
Terrific. Pano, thank you very much for that. It's fascinating. So Andrea, Pano is saying that within this recent report, that the makers of hardware or software that release code, as an example, that have bugs in it, that there should be some liability that flows from that. That's a tough thing for boards and management teams. So what are your initial thoughts?
Well, this is the holy grail, is who has liability. That's one of the big issues. We're in this explosive, brand new frontier, and nobody really knows which end is up, and we're all kind of crawling in the dark trying to figure out who has responsibility for what, et cetera. So, I don't have a specific answer for you, but I think it's a journey where we're all going to be sort of negotiating back and forth, trying to pass along the liability to the next company or the next organization. And it's going to be, the survival of the fittest, of the smartest, who are able to, of the strongest also. The big companies are going to be able to push it down to their supply chain, potentially in terms of liability. But let me backtrack to my perspective and just give a sense to people why I'm here, because my domain or my area of expertise is limited more to the organization, the corporation. As you mentioned earlier, Peter, I advise companies. I also work with nonprofits and with government agencies. But basically, my expertise is how does that organization, whether it's a business or a university or a nonprofit, how does that organization create cyber resilience? Resilience generally, but cyber resilience specifically. And it's a tough nut to crack, but there are things that can be done. So I'll just tell a quick sort of biographical journey that got me here, because I think it's illustrative of why I do what I do and why I think so many different kinds of people are necessary in this conversation. Going from the international legal negotiations between nations all the way down to how do I create an information security program for my company that's as airtight as possible. And so we need lawyers, we need IT people, we need risk managers, we need compliance people, we need business people. And my journey started way back in Y2K land when I was a general counsel for a power company. And suddenly it fell in my lap that I was responsible for taking care of Y2K, which for those of you who are too young to remember, it was basically all computers going to shut down the moment we entered the 2000 year, because computers hadn't been programmed to go that far past 1999. And it was a big nothing burger at the end of the day, but it was something where we all sort of scrambled around this technology issue. 10 years later, I worked for another company where I was their chief risk audit and compliance officer. And I suddenly inherited information security because that company had information security reporting into the chief technology officer. And they decided that it wasn't really properly structured in that function. It was something that needed more of a governance touch. So I spent 6 months of painful full-time inquiry into what is information security. Being a lawyer coming from a non-technical, non-engineering background, it was a bit painful for me. It was also difficult to understand the lingo. And so slowly but surely, I came to two conclusions. One was that information security was everybody's business. It was not something that should stay in the technology department or any other department for that matter. And secondly, that it's a governance issue. And so in that particular situation, I realized it's the CEO and the executive team and the business leaders around the organization that really have to take ownership of this issue and define the philosophy of cybersecurity that that company needs. So every company is different. Some companies are very high risk, others are maybe a little bit less risk, but as Robert Mueller said years ago when he was the director of the FBI, there's only two kinds of companies, those that know they have been cyber attacked and those that don't. And so we all need to be cyber ready. And I think it's part of a resilience building in general. And what does resilience building mean? I think it means having that governance piece where the board and the senior management are on the same page about a strategy for their security, information security. It then trickles into the various components of the organization, the risk management, IT, legal, financial, all of the different functions that make the company run. It also trickles into, not trickles, it's very importantly part of crisis management and preparedness, business continuity, data protection. So it has that sort of cross-functional, cross-disciplinary, cross-divisional application. Because at the end of the day, if you're a big company with lots of units and there's a weak link over here, forget about these other well-protected organizations being safe. So I don't know if I'm running out of time here, but those are some of the sort of the general things I wanted to share. There are a couple of other things I think that are important to think about. And Scott mentioned sustainability and his background. I'm very involved with ESG issues, and I really think that cyber is part of that package of non-financial issues, that if you're not taking care of them, your risk management is exposed to additional reputational risk. If you look at any of the cyber incidents, especially the early ones that occurred, those companies got hit really hard from a reputational standpoint because they weren't prepared and they delayed and they maybe lied about their issues for months or years even. And so there's a very intricate interconnection between cyber risk, reputation risk, and having good crisis management and good business continuity. So I don't know if I have more time, but I'll leave it at that if that's good enough for now.
Andrea, that's a wonderful intro. Thank you for that. This concept of decoding complex terms, if you're really going to get the board, the senior management team, the leadership of an organization, you need to be dealing from a common informational foundation. We've had a slew of questions come in, and some of them are so good, I want to go to them right away. So the first question from a gentleman named Aaron: how does cyber peace succeed if China and Russia, two global powers, are unwilling to engage in cyber accountability and use it as a domain of global power? Scott, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. It's funny because Russia and China actually have been putting forward, cyber codes of conduct now for more than a decade, right? But what they mean by that is pretty different from what we think about it in terms of, cybersecurity and cyber peace from a more Western perspective. So part of it is that we are kind of talking past each other. I don't think that, for example, we're going to be able to get all countries for sure, including the cyber powers like Russia and China, to sign on to some grand treaty of cyberspace that would limit, for example, the use of zero-day exploits attacking civilian critical infrastructure. We could write something like that, but even if we could get an agreement, enforcing it would be extremely difficult. So I see this as being a very long game, right? Kind of like we saw with the climate context that Andrea mentioned with sustainability. This isn't going to be a short-term finish line, but what we're trying to encourage, and what I take some heart in at least, is more of the bilateral and the regional and what we call these kind of polycentric forums that are being created to push the ball forward, like the Paris call. And to the extent that we can find that common ground, maybe at first among some like-minded countries and private sector representatives and civil society groups, great, and that can kind of grow from there. But no, I agree. We're not going to see the end of cyber attacks, but I don't think that should be the goal, right? I think it's unrealistic. If that was really the goal, you can think about the real world context, right? We're never going to have a state in the world where there will just be zero violence. That would be wonderful, right? But at the same time, we're not at war. So we have to live below the threshold. And I think there's a lot that we can do at each of these levels to make that living, frankly, a lot more sustainable than it has been so far, at least.
Scott, thank you for that. Andrea spoke about demystifying some of the language. You referenced zero-day exploits. What's a zero-day exploits for the non-technologists on the call?
That was to me. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Peter. So zero-day exploits, these are basically flaws, vulnerabilities in operating systems and software that just nobody knows about yet. Hence, 0 day, as in day one. They are, the global currency of cybercrime insofar as the most valuable assets out there. You know, credit card numbers can be worth a couple of pennies, if that, at this point. But if you have your hands on a zero-day exploit, that's like a magic key that gets you in the back door. That's why they're so valuable for criminal organizations and even nation states, which stockpile them. And then that gets us into this interesting national security and ethical balancing act of when you disclose those vulnerabilities back to vendors so they can be patched, and when they're actually withheld and used as cyber weapons. So
Great.
which also gets us thinking about, are we going to be more peaceful and secure if we're more, aggressive, if we're more, proactive in terms of this active defense strategy, or are we going to do a better job at building kind of deterrence and denial by basically making it a lot harder to hack into these systems?
Mm-hmm. Pano, cyber peace sounds quite grandiose and difficult to achieve given the reality of the actors that are involved. In 2015, the United States and China entered into a cyber code of conduct. Is that the type of thing that you think is the concrete step that leads closer towards cyber peace, or was that not effective?
That's a good question. So in 2015, when President Obama and President Xi met in the Rose Garden in the White House, I believe what was achieved on that day was a huge milestone in getting China's government to admit that intellectual property theft via cyberspace was wrong. What that meant in practicality was, great, it's wrong. It's kind of like the criminal says guilty as charged, goes to jail for a couple of years, and then comes out with a vengeance at the end of the day. So that's what I believe happened. China shaped its behavior a little bit. It's arguable here. Some argue that they actually stopped hacking. Others argue that they just were quieter, maybe using zero-day vulnerabilities that are harder to detect. But they still continued to pilfer, and we've only seen that pilfering on the uptick. So like most agreements and treaties, they are time-bound. And as we've seen throughout history, agreements can be broken at will by one violator. And I think Scott did a great job in the previous question, kind of outlining the complexities of accountability under any form of agreement. So,
So if the code of conduct was bilateral between US and China, what could an organization like NATO, what would you like to see NATO do as an example to advance this agenda?
So I'll start from my biased perspective of shoring up their own network defenses and hardening themselves from known vulnerabilities. 0 days are a completely different challenge, but what you can do is shore up defenses to known vulnerabilities. By doing that, you impose costs on NATO's chief adversary, Russia, to make them maybe burn some of their more exquisite tools in their tool sets, thereby letting us learn more about their capabilities and that kind of stuff. There is discussion about, or there are some perspectives that maybe NATO for cyber is an outmoded concept. Maybe we need to have a more dynamic alliance of countries with different capabilities, like-minded states that come together to form coalitions to encounter cyber problems as they arise on a basis of a trusted mechanism. The former Estonian president announced this about 2 years ago, and it's a very interesting concept of kind of creating a cyber NATO rather than relying on the existing alliance structure and the slow political processes that it requires to make a decision in order to push the ball forward on an issue.
Andrea, let's shift back to a corporate setting. So it's so important for management and the board to have a sense of key indicators. If you've said that the weakest link can undermine an organization's resilience, what are 2 or 3 concrete cyber elements that should be included in a dashboard that management or the board would review?
So I'm going to answer that in 2 parts. First and foremost, my best advice to boards and companies is that they do what they need to do in advance of the crisis. So what that means is the board needs to proactively require from management proof that they have a crisis management plan, that they have a data backup plan, that they have a business continuity plan, and that they basically are doing this proactively through a team. Sometimes that team might include a board member as well. That's a best practice that very few have, but have them as at least someone that they communicate with when there is a potential cyber or other crisis. So having that structural preparedness in advance also means having a good interface with the IT and cyber security management components, and having them come up and do a report, hopefully quarterly, to the board of what's going on. And in those metrics, talking about structural things and talking about metrics. And the structural things are some of the things I just mentioned. How is cyber risk integrated with enterprise risk management? How is cyber risk and cyber information security audited and monitored from time to time? And what are the results of that? Do you have a third party that's come in that's objective, independent, and has looked at the metrics and the structure of your information security group and approach? And then have some metrics that are really meaningful for the board, which is, again, several times removed from the front lines. And among the ones that I think are important is knowing about access management controls, knowing how many administrators of your network are authorized. If you have many, that means your security is exponentially exposed. If you have a very tight control of how few you can use, that's a much better security posture. Having some type of metrics about intrusion attempts and how that happens over time and how that's been countered to the extent that it increases is another important metric. Then there's some metrics around mean time to detect, mean time to control, mean time to resolve. So having, a sense of that your team is on top of this stuff, is watching it, and that your board is actually able to look at these things. Now, I'll just add one more pet peeve or theme that I talk about all the time, which is if your board doesn't have the right people on there asking these questions, someone who has risk management expertise or technology expertise, or even sustainability and corporate responsibility expertise, you have a lower chance of having the right questions being asked and the right requirements being demanded of management in terms of how they oversee ESG and cyber and some other things. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Scott, you mentioned in your earlier remarks the importance of protecting critical infrastructure. In the United States, unlike in many other countries, much of the critical infrastructure, some people believe more than 80% as an example, is owned or operated by the private sector. So what is one thing that you would like to see either industry do or the government do to enhance the public-private partnership around protecting critical infrastructure?
Yeah, it's such an important topic. You're absolutely right. Critical infrastructure really is in the eye of the beholder, as you said, Peter, and each country defines that differently. There's 7 critical infrastructure sectors in the EU, for example, as compared to 16 in the US, and we keep adding them, right? So, for example, January 2017, all of a sudden, our election infrastructure became part of our public facilities and critical infrastructure. And you get to the point when we include healthcare, finance, et cetera, well, if everything's critical, is anything critical? So we haven't taken that politically difficult next step yet of figuring out what's the most critical of critical infrastructure, and which benchmark should those industries be required to meet. There's been some efforts to do that over the years. For example, there was an effort back in 2012 to pass an omnibus bill that would have given DHS more authority to establish those benchmarks and provide a safe harbor in return if those companies actually were breached. That obviously was filibustered, didn't go anywhere. These days, one thing we're trying to push is this idea of a national cybersecurity safety board modeled loosely after the NTSB, which would be a step in investigating cyber attacks, just kind of like what we see after a big airline disaster or a train accident, something like that. where there wouldn't be any liability presumed. Lawyers wouldn't be part of the team there. There were too many of us already, right? Rather, we would have investigators coming from lots of different disciplines, computer scientists, forensics experts, et cetera, who would be on site figuring out what happened and then helping to attribute those attacks back to whichever party might be responsible. And then in turn, Congress could consider, which also often happens in the NTSB context, new legislation to make those recommendations actually have the binding force of law behind them. There is a draft bill that's being worked on in Congress. We've done some work on this. I did a piece for the Wall Street Journal about a year ago on it. I think it has some merit. There's definitely drawbacks. Clearly, we could investigate every cyber attack. There's hundreds of thousands of them. So we got to figure out what are the most important, either in terms of novelty or in terms of how many people or industries are impacted. But I think that could be one way where we don't have to keep kind of reinventing the wheel, where we could actually spread awareness between these industry sectors, kind of break down those silos, and hopefully raise all boats to contribute to cyber peace in that way.
Mm-hmm. The NTSB example is fascinating in trying to identify the cause of what the accident or the attack. So Pano, you spoke about putting liability on corporations, for example, that either manufacture software or hardware or that fail to implement the right patches. How do you raise the costs of cyber attacks on the attacker? What is a way of really creating a measure of deterrence that really matters?
So I'll use two examples, one technical, the other strategic. So on the technical level, it's really about making sure that you're starting off with a good system concept and design, and making sure that you've designed security into your system from the get-go. By doing that, you can communicate requirements to a software vendor, put the right language in contracts to make sure that you're not getting unnecessary features or you're turning off features that might be exploitable by a threat actor. So what you're doing with that at a technical level is you're kind of cutting out the low-hanging fruit in terms of threat actors, your criminals, your hacktivists, those entities that might not have the resources to get a more exquisite cyber tool, and you're raising the bar up to nation states that might start going after specific targets aligned with their national industrial policies, for example. When you raise it up to nation states, when you raise the cost back up to the billions of dollars, where you need a full spectrum actor that's manipulating not only technology, but people and processes, and you catch them, you're returning back to traditional national power politics. And that's the strategic part of the cost imposition, of then calling out nation states and imposing some sort of cost on malign behavior in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. Right now, because it's a free-for-all in reality, and nation states and criminals are using that low-hanging fruit because it's less costly, the result is that state actors can hide behind the smokescreen of criminal organizations, privateers, and others in the domain. So by raising the cost of an attack, making it focused on only nation states being able to successfully carry out an attack, we can then come back to a more realist paradigm of international relations with all the loaded connotations that comes with in the IR circles.
Mm-hmm. So you put a fair bit of faith in the idea that attribution, who really caused the attack, can be determined, and then you can make some linkages from perhaps disparate actors into nation states. So let's shift for a moment. There's a question from Karen. What do the panelists think about it being made a crime for an individual or news organization to publish stolen information? Who would like to take that?
I did a piece for The Conversation a couple of weeks ago that kind of looked at the global drive to regulate misinformation. So I can give you just a few quick reactions to that based on what we're seeing around the world. We also do have a longer law review article coming out. This is with the Washington and Lee Law Review, which is basically looking at protecting democracies against various forms of digital repression. So I can provide maybe a link and we can send that out afterwards if anybody's interested in that. But in brief, we're seeing lots of countries criminalize the sharing of misinformation. We see that in Thailand, for example, in Indonesia, in Myanmar. In Thailand, it's concerning because already it's been used in some instances to basically silence dissidents. Because again, kind of like critical infrastructure, misinformation can also be a bit in the eye of the beholder. Especially given some of the regimes in power across this part of the world. We have seen those countries that have tried this, like Thailand, like even India, even some democracies like that, and Indonesia, come at it from varying perspectives. In Indonesia, there's now a cabinet level agency set up to regulate misinformation because the government thinks it's been just frankly so potentially damaging to the stability of that country. And we're left with a kind of the Western democracies in a bit of a conundrum, especially the US, right? Because historically, we have taken a very hands-off approach to regulating content, right? That was one of our core criticisms of that cyber code of conduct idea that Russia and China, put forward more than 15 years ago now. Well, they were going to be regulating content to promote censorship, to control these restive populations. We're not about that. We want to secure these 4 freedoms on the internet, right? Including freedom of speech. But now with the spread of misinformation, not only related to election security, but now, of course, the pandemic as well, a lot of democracies, including the US, like we see with the news today, and the platforms that are spread across these democracies, like Facebook, are having to approach it in kind of a new way. So one idea I'll throw out there is what the EU's done. And I'd love to hear other thoughts as well. The EU has put forward, they basically strong-armed the big tech platforms to sign on to a code for disinformation about a year and a half ago now, right? And this basically meant that these tech platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, would have to share as quickly as possible with the national level governments that might be at issue, such as, for example, the Brexit debate, things like that. Any instances of disinformation that are spotted, they had then a timeline to take down that information. And then there would be responses related to the right to be forgotten, frankly, that's also active in the EU. So, that EU code for disinformation is far from perfect. It's had its critiques, but that's one way we could basically push the tech companies to globalize that code so that we wouldn't have, in this case, the US government front and center raising those constitutional issues, but we would have the tech platforms taking more ownership and basically practicing the type of corporate social responsibility that Andrea mentioned in the sustainability context.
Great. Let's shift to Pano. Scott really answered that in the context of misinformation or disinformation. The question was also challenging the proposition that if a news organization obtains information that has been stolen, should it be a crime for the news organization to publish that? What do you think?
In my opinion, in a free democratic society, it really depends. So I'm going to go with no, but. So the no is that it should not be a crime in the case of, say, a news organization posting documents that it received without its will. It just arrived in a package on their front door. It's an editorial decision. You don't want to go down the slippery slope of restricting journalists from letting the public know what information they received. If the news organization is actively tasking a hacker group to go after that information, that becomes a different story because now they have a hand in the crime. The other but is, what do we mean by the information as well? So is it just classified documents? Is it proprietary corporate secrets? Or is it AutoCAD files that contain industrial designs that would cause significant harm to a company if all of a sudden, say, the New York Times got the plans for the latest jet engine? That's in digital information. If that gets hung out on the internet, that I believe is automatically a crime because of intellectual theft, property theft laws.
Okay, thank you for that. Andrea, so you're an expert in advising boards and management teams. Ransomware is a fairly common form of attack. Is there any scenario in your judgment where it would be appropriate, where you would advise a board or a management team to pay a ransom in order to liberate their files?
That's a really tricky question, and I'm going to use my legal hat to say it depends on the facts, but in most cases, no. But there are those situations where it's a $3,000 request that prevents a multi-billion-dollar M&A transaction to go forward, for example. That's an extreme example, but so it really depends on the circumstances. What I would actually, emphasize to the company that's in that situation is if you had been prepared in advance and you had some form of strategy that you have put together at the board and executive levels on what you're going to do if there is a ransomware attack, and really have tactical steps that you outlined as to when you would, when you wouldn't, who you would consult with, whether you'd get in a third party to really help you with penetration testing and other kinds of things that would arm you with the resilience that I talk about all the time. That's really the answer, because you can't prevent these things from happening per se, but you can have a really good business continuity plan in place where you've backed up all your data to a separate set of distant locations that are not attacked, and so you have replicate data that you don't need to pay the ransomware. So there's a battle plan companies can create to at least salvage the majority of the situation. And I heard recently about a city, I can't remember which city it was, where they had exactly done that, and they did not need to submit to the ransomware because they had all their files backed up to a remote server. And similar situation, we're in the middle of COVID right now, healthcare industry, the medical industry, the pharma companies, they're all potentially targets of ransomware, not potentially, they're actually. And the ones that are going to survive better and have less of a problem are the ones that have thought this through in advance and have some kind of a backup plan. And of course, the outside experts coming in to be their security counterforce, shall we say. So you need to have several things in place. It's a crisis management like any other, but you really have to be prepared in advance.
Your reference to healthcare organizations is spot on. Hospitals have been one of the most common targets of ransomware attacks because of the exigencies of the moment, surgeries being conducted and the like. Okay, the questions continue to come in for Pano or Scott from an FPA member. Have governments drawn sufficiently clear lines on what type of cyber attack would constitute an act of war?
I'll take it. Okay, go ahead, Pano, please, feel free.
Sure, I'll keep it brief and then pass it over to Scott because I know he's itching to take it too. So cyber war is in the eye of the beholder. War is always a political decision, right? So if a low-level incident triggers the political decision to go to war, we're in a cyber war. But I believe the nature of the question is really at what point does something rise to the level of an armed attack in cyberspace? And that really also depends on which country. So from the United States' perspective, physical damage, loss of life and injury are kind of the obvious cases that would rise to the level of an armed attack. However, so would disruption to system functionality. So if a threat actor decides to go in and encrypt the nuclear command and control system of the United States via cyber attack, that probably within the lens of the US government would rise to a level of an armed attack, even though there has been no clear loss of life or damage and destruction. And I'll cut my remarks short and pass it over to Scott for.
Great. Well, let me hop in there. You made a reference to the loss of life. Scott, do you think it's a likely outcome that a cyber attack in the next 2 to 3 years results actually in an explosion or a physical incident that caused actually the loss of life?
Let's hope not. The technology definitely makes that possible. So we've seen, for example, attacks on a blast furnace in Germany, which caused it to overheat, and there was an explosion associated with that. We've seen cyber attacks cause real world damage now for more than 10 years. Think back to Stuxnet, right? So the fact that it hasn't happened more, I think, is heartening, but I don't think it's because of any technical limitations there. But Pano's exactly right. That would feed into this question of, all right, when does that constitute then, in terms of its equivalent effects, an act of war? I don't think, frankly, that countries have done enough to answer that question, and a lot of them do it very differently. That's one thing that's happening, for example, right now at the UN as part of the current round. It's called the Group of Government Experts, and there was a US-sponsored resolution at the UN last year that now is encouraging each of the UN member states, starting with the group in this particular club, basically, to say how they think international law should apply to cyberspace. It's been widespread. There's been widespread agreement that it does. For example, since the G20 said it did in 2015, but now we're getting to these thorny issues of exactly how does it. And frankly, the deafening silence in the aftermath of the publication of the Talon manuals, both 1.0 and 2.0, I think is pretty telling. So my hope is that, this UN process plays out and we get a little bit more transparency of how countries are interpreting this, since state practice is still so important.
Okay, let me go back to Pano, if I could, with a question from Joshua. Scott referenced Stuxnet. The question is, would you consider the use of Stuxnet, and perhaps you could explain briefly what it was, a precedent-setting incident which set the rule that cyber attacks are less than actual war, such that we cannot react to a cyber attack like a physical attack?
So the brief backgrounder on Stuxnet for the audience is in 2010, Iran's nuclear centrifuges that were under UN sanctions were targeted by a very sophisticated worm that, long story short, caused a disruption and destruction of the nuclear centrifuges. My answer to that specific question is no, in the context of Stuxnet, only because of kind of where I see that event in cyber history. It's kind of goes against the grain of the conventional wisdom, in that a lot of individuals think that because there was a physical effect on Iran's nuclear centrifuge, that constitutes to an attack, and therefore, because of that unique aspect of its physicality, that some country cause an attack against Iran. My perspective is that if we look at it from the geopolitical and legal context, this was a nuclear infrastructure that was under UN sanctions, so we could potentially look at this as a sanctions enforcement tool, because the specific components that were targeted by the code were on sanctions lists from the International Atomic Energy Agency Commission, the UN Security Council, and whoever caused the disruption had the power to completely melt down the nuclear infrastructure, but they chose to do very specific disruptive effects that did not really rise up to the use of force. So the short answer is no to the question.
Okay, thank you for that. Andrea, a question about intellectual property that's come in from an FPA member. Do you have any idea how much intellectual property has been stolen from US companies, and who is committing the bulk of this cyber theft? Any insight?
I only know what's out there publicly, which is that there has been over time a lot of intellectual property theft via cyber means, and specifically China has figured high on the list in terms of either nation state or other actors accomplishing this. My understanding is that that's declined a little bit in recent times because China is now an intellectual property powerhouse in its own right, having developed a lot of new technology, AI, et cetera, 5G, that they themselves have been able to develop. So it was kind of almost a developmental stage. And I've heard from some wiser people than me that the US did that way back in our history. We stole IP from others and built up our economy that way. So I don't have enough insight to give any numbers or any sort of more learned kind of answers, but I think that, yeah, it's happening, and I'm sure there are other countries that are doing it as well. And I wouldn't venture to guess who. Maybe my learned colleagues here have some insights into this.
These are difficult questions. There've been some focus on China and Russia. This one a little closer. How can we ensure accountability of our own cyber behavior, considering all that we've learned from the Snowden documents and the CIA's Vault 7 cyber weapons files? Scott or Pano, you game to take that one?
I can give a few quick reactions. This has been a process of experimentation for sure, especially over the last decade. Sometimes I'd argue at least we've gotten it right, and other times, we've, I think, made some mistakes in terms of the U.S. position on cybersecurity. We've done a lot of great work in pushing the norms agenda, including through the G7 and the G20, at least up until 2017. But even since then, there's been some progress made. What we've seen, I think, in terms of mistakes, I'd argue at least, is, I think it's good, for example, that we're being transparent with how we do this vulnerabilities equities process in terms of when we decide to disclose these vulnerabilities back to vendors. But frankly, the ones that we've kept close to the chest, we haven't done a good job at safeguarding, right? So shadow brokers is a famous example of basically all these NSA, cyber weapons that were basically pilfered. Right. And as a result, we had a ransomware epidemic from WannaCry to what we've seen in Baltimore to, Atlanta, and then more recently. I think that just shows that even when we have the best interest, in this case of what we think of security, planning for that rainy day at heart, that's a double-edged sword. When we launch a cyber attack, you're basically also launching the blueprints for how to reverse engineer it and send it back at you. So that's, I think, one way that we've gotten it wrong. I think ultimately there's going to have to be a decision made about how we can do it better. The Obama administration got a lot of criticism because they were perceived as not being active enough in sometimes, right? So now we have this presidential directive where no longer does the president have to sign off on these cyber attacks the way that had been the case before, right? So now the U.S. Cyber Command has more discretion. We're going to see how that plays out, especially going into this fall. Like we saw in 2018 on the day of the midterms, Cybercom, shut down a Russian troll farm. Will we see something like that on the lead up to this coming election? Ultimately, does that increased amount, the degree of cyber, intrusions, in this case, state-sponsored, does that increase the overall level of cybersecurity because it makes it more challenging, or countries think twice then before attacking us? Or does that just increase, instability when, for example, American companies become in the crosshairs as well, as Andrea well knows? So it's a really difficult balancing act. And I think, the next president, whoever they might be, are going to have a lot on their plate in thinking through these debates.
Pano, Scott referenced governments disclosing exploits that they are aware of. Earlier this year, the NSA disclosed a vulnerability that it was aware of so that companies and others could patch the vulnerability. Is that the type of behavior that you want to see from governments to advance this cyber peace agenda?
Most definitely, it is. So, but the difficulty with 0 days that a government might know is what they're being used for in intelligence or military operations. So I'll use an extreme example just to illustrate the challenge of that intel gain loss problem. Let's assume that we know that there's a vulnerability that's a 0 day that's known to the NSA that's also being used to track a group in Antarctica. That group in Antarctica is about to attack an ice station near the Ross Ice Shelf. And if the government discloses that vulnerability, even though it'll be for the greater public good, there will be scientists hurt at the Ross Ice Shelf, right? So that's always the balancing act that has to occur when we're thinking about revealing a vulnerability for the greater good to help shore up, kind of inoculate the world's computer servers if they do apply a patch, versus taking the vulnerability off the streets and making harm imminent to civilians.
Excellent. Okay, we have about a minute left. Are there any closing thoughts that any of you would like to share?
I'll jump in with my sort of smaller worldview. We've been talking about cyber peace and international legal and other relations. And I think there's a role that all of us play in this, even just individuals, in terms of keeping cyber hygiene going in our own personal lives, in our worker lives, in our student lives, where we're careful about not clicking on that phishing link, not allowing things to happen with our own systems. So cyber training, cyber hygiene, those are things that companies should be doing very proactively on a daily basis with their own employees, and especially now with COVID-19, distributing employees and workers all over the place to their homes, which has created a whole new set of vulnerabilities, not only for the people, but for the intellectual property and other things that belong to the company. And so I think we have to even up our game more than before in terms of resilience building and creating that culture, that cyber culture of hygiene and care. And I think if you have those points of light of resilience in the corporate world and the organizational world, then also doing private-public partnerships, also sectoral partnerships, we have to all sort of raise our ships and do a better job of taking care of our own backyards and then contributing to the health of our nations and our society in general. So I'll leave it at that.
Personal cyber hygiene contributes to the national civilian defense in some ways. Pano, Scott, final thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that was a great point, Andrea. Cyber, unlike other forms of conflict, is very much a home game, both a home game in terms of in our own living rooms, bedrooms, but also in terms of the United States. So whereas in the past, adversaries have not been able to reach out and touch us other than on very few occasions throughout our history, right now, cyber opens up that potentiality for the fight being brought to us. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Scott?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Andrea and Pano here, right? It is up to all of us. And I think as we all do our part, it's important to avoid, classic false choices, right? We don't have to choose between a top-down or kind of a bottom-up approach to this. And a lot of the work that we've been doing, we kind of leverage this idea of a polycentric approach, right? Where we leverage all the cool things happening at all these different levels around a common problem. That was work that Lynn Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics more than 10 years ago now, really pioneered. And this year, 2020, we're celebrating the 30-year anniversary of her book, Governing the Commons. And in that book, she made the point that trust is the most important resource. So I think everything that we can do to build trust and learn from that background, including the importance of interaction and coordination at a lot of different levels, can really pay dividends here. As Rob Nackey, I think, ultimately said, I think are in for a networked and distributed approach to a networked and distributed problem. So we're all in this together, but I think there's hope.
What a wonderful close, Scott. In an era of deep fakes and misinformation and disinformation, trust is in some ways really the most important currency of all. And so we'll now bring this to a close. If everyone please would thank our three superb panelists, thank our co-hosts, both the FPA and NYU, and also thank the audience for really outstanding questions. I'm glad I was the moderator here and not the panelist. Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.